Welcome back, folks. We are in An Ape's Guide to Human Language, and we have been thinking about what it is about human language that allows our communication to achieve things that seem to be different than other primates. So what we've been thinking about is starting off with this idea that there may be something special about the sounds we use in our communication. And what we saw last time is that humans take some time to align to the adult patterns of sensitivity that adults from the same community share with them. And we might want to ask this question from the examples that we saw. Does it mean that baby humans start out with the ability to hear the sounds from every single language in the world and then just kind of hone in on those few sounds that their own language uses? Do they go through a process of loss of sensitivity to acquire the patterns of the adults in their speech community? So to answer this question, I want to talk about the other kinds of consonants that we haven't talked so much about for a while, which is vowels. So you remember from our MRI examples that when we break down the shape of the articulators during speech, we get these different patterns of tongue position when we're making different vowels. Now, vowels are very easy. The only rules you need for vowels is to phonate at the glottis, produce some sound at the glottis, and have your mouth open. If you have those two things, then pretty much you're pretty guaranteed to have a vowel if there are no obstructions in the way. So the vowels that we've been talking about mostly so far are the E vowel, where the tongue is bunched up towards the front of the palate, the R vowel, where the whole tongue is pulled down as far as possible, but because the tongue is so massive, we have to open the jaw a little to achieve a very big ah sound. This is why doctors say, open your mouth and say ah when they want to sit down your throat. Ah. And the oo vowel sound, where the back of the tongue is bunched up at the back of the mouth and the lips have been protruded to stick out in a oo shape. Okay, so E, R, oo, and we're talking about this as the vowel triangle. The reason the vowel triangle is important is because these are the most peripheral positions that you can put your articulators in, which means these are the sounds that are most distinct from each other. Now, in the MRI, we know we can't see all of the tissue structures, so sometimes it helps to visualize the same data in different ways. These are our MRI reconstructions that show a little bit of the lip shape and the shape of the air cavity, right from the soft tissues and the skin of the palate all the way through to the top of the tongue. So once again, we can see the E, the tongue is pushed up and to the front, leaving only a small channel for air to pass. The oo is bunched up at the back, and the tongue is like pulled down a little at the front and depressed a bit so that you can have this large air volume in front of the back of the tongue. And then the ah sound, we can see the tongue is pulled quite low, and these wrinkly bits we can see here are the shapes of the inside of the teeth. So once again, the E, R, oo vowel triangle. Now, conveniently enough, if we record our own speech, there is a property that we can measure from the speech that can tell us about how high up the tongue is, like the E and the oo tongue, versus how low down the tongue is, like the ah vowel, and also how bunchy it is towards the front or towards the back. So the front of the triangle versus the back of the triangle. So when we record vowels, we can record those formants, those patterns of wave interaction that have the most energy. So we've talked about wave interactions before, and if we have a transverse wave propagating through water, and that wave hits the side of a pool and bounces back with its own wave pattern. As those two waves intersect, there will be some peaks and some troughs. And when we get a bundle of energy patterning together, we can measure that as a formant. So this is a formant chart coming up that shows a lot of different speakers articulating vowels of American English. So these vowels were articulated in words, and each participant read from a word list. And we can see that each participant's voice generates a single combination of, in this case, the first formant and the second formant over here. Now, when we put together the first formant and the second formant, I'm just going to start with these blue shapes over here. We get lots and lots and lots and lots of individual tokens of E. So this is the E vowel in peach and beach. What we have in the next circle, these kind of greeny, olivey colored ones, are the I vowel, which in my variety of English is a little bit different from the E vowel. So for me, peach and pitch are quite different. That may not be the case for your variety of English. In fact, we've done a study on that too, but I'm not going to talk about that one today. Next, over in black, we have the air, or in this case, we have air, and in the other gray, we have vowels as well. We have in bright red the a vowel, that in my variety of English is a different vowel. In your variety of English, for some of you, you have this as a separate vowel, and others, it's more combined together with other vowel sounds. And what we can see, if we just target the E in blue and the U over here, it also in blue, and the R vowels down in gray and black, what we can see is a sort of a triangle shape. Now I'm just going to sort of rearrange this graph because these measurements are done in regular numbering format, but it's easier to see the triangle if I first of all flip it sideways, right? And then I turn it around a bit. So now what we can see is that E-R-U shape. So the measurements from the acoustics of speech give us one dimension that tells us how high up or down the tongue is in the mouth. That's the first formant. We'll see some examples of this a little later on in your activity, right? So we have one measurement that tells us a little bit about roughly how high up or down the tongue is in the mouth, the first formant. And then we have a second measurement, the second formant, that tells us something about how bunched up towards the front or towards the back of the mouth the tongue is. And the data about the position of the tongue in the mouth, it's all right there. We can see really clearly that this is the limit of the range of motion that we have in our human mouths. But there is one more thing we can do. We can take the tongue position of the E vowel and the lip position of the U vowel and put them together. And if we do that, we get U. Now, for some of you, this is another speech sound that exists in your language, but maybe not for all of you. So I'm just going to show you a little chart of where in the world we would expect to hear this sound. So what we can see here is from the World Atlas of Language Structures. We can see each white dot here is a different language in the world, and the colored in dots are the languages that have these vowels where you have a combination of rounded lips, like in a U vowel, but the tongue also high and front. So a U sound, right? Now there are different colors for whether it's the very, very highest sound like a U, or also a U, or just or both of those or just one of them. But we can see that there's quite a few European languages. So German and French and lots of Scandinavian languages have these kinds of sounds. But over here in Asia, we also have some representation as well. And Mandarin Chinese is one of these languages. So if it's possible to tell from the first formant how high or low the tongue is in the mouth, and from the second formant how far forwards or back it is there another acoustic feature that tells us about whether the lips are oo or e? So stuck out the front or pulled right back? Turns out that's roughly given to us by the third formant. So those patterns of wave interactions are really telling us about the shape of the pipe. So if we bring these three vowel dimensions together, then what we get is our old vowel triangle, the E, R, U triangle, but with that third dimension added in, which is whether or not the lips are rounded or the lips are spread. And we end up with this kind of acoustic space for everything that every position it's possible to put your articulators in. Takes up this kind of shape in three-dimensional vowel space. So what does this mean for perception? And I wanted to sort of talk us through the production and the measurement stuff just so that we can come back to perception. Because we might want to ask ourselves about where perception starts and how it develops when we have this very complicated three-dimensional shape. So once again, we have our E, R, U triangle, but we can also change between E, and if I just make an E sound and then round my lips while I'm doing it, E, U, 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 right? You can see how the nature of that sound changed. Or if I make an oo sound and then I slide my tongue forwards, ooh, 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 right? It's a combination of the E tongue and the oo lips. So we might think that babies are going to be aligned to the categories of the sounds that are spoken around them. So English-speaking babies who only hear English and do not have any E vowels in their language. Now, I should say that this letter E, the letter Y is used as the symbol for the U in the International Phonetic Alphabet. So it's sometimes written as that U with the umlaut, right? The two little dots above it. But for simplicity, the International Phonetic Alphabet has chosen a different letter of the alphabet to represent it. So you might think that babies that hear this sound or versus babies that don't hear this sound are going to have different perception for this sound, right? So here's a bunch of English babies who are tested on their ability to detect a change from oo, 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 e, which they fail at, or e, 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 oo, which they succeed at. So they're able to pick out the oo sound, which is one that they have in their language, but they're not able to pick out the e sound. However, if you go to German babies, you might expect the opposite pattern, or a different pattern at least, because German babies are hearing both oo and e in their speech. But these German babies, when they're tested on oo, 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 e, they fail. When they're tested on e, 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 oo, they pass, exactly the same as the English babies. So even though the U sound only occurs in one language, both groups of babies find it easier to hear oo than U. So we've mapped this out on our little acoustic space like this. We have failures in the U department and successes in the oo department. Let's check some other sounds. Here's another sound, but this time the A sound only exists in English, but not in German. So now we're seeing whether we can hear the difference between A, 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 E, and E, 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 A. And both groups of babies show the same pattern. This time they fail to catch a sound that's sort of in the middle at the front, the E sound, but they pass at hearing a sound that's closer to the periphery of vowel space, this front low A sound. And so these researchers have sort of teamed up with others and over a series of years tested tons and tons of different sounds and eventually come up with a pattern that looks a little bit like this. It sort of doesn't seem to matter which pairs of sounds you test. If you try and switch from a sound that is like at the corners of the mouth to a sound that is towards the middle, babies seem to fail. But if you start with sounds in the middle and go outwards, babies seem to pass. So this is telling us something about the sounds E, Ah, and Oo, which we talked about in terms of the articulators earlier on. They seem to be perceptually salient. So the peripheries of the acoustic space act as what we can think of as perceptual anchors. They're easier to hear, they're easier to remember, they catch our attention, and they become really sticky. So what has our ape learnt from this example? Not all sounds are equal. Some sounds really are easier to hear than others when babies are first starting out on this learning journey. So we might want to ask whether or not any of the members of our species make use of this in our communications. So one fascinating area of research that has been growing over the past few years, decades now, has been the idea of how people talk to babies. So we've seen these perceptual anchors, the E, the Ah, and the Oo, as being really, really good for babies' hearing. They're easier to perceive for babies. Well, it turns out that when babies are being talked to by their caregivers, there's a tendency for parents to change their speech in ways that makes it better for babies' hearing. And one of the ways that we can measure is to measure the way that parents say certain vowels when they're talking to babies versus when they're talking to adults. So we have here a little map of normal adult to adult speech where we might have an E, ah, oo that are not very distinct. E, ah, oo, E, ah, oo. And yet when people speak to babies, they have a tendency to say E, ah, ooh, or exaggerate the full dynamic range of their vocalizations. So this is telling us that adult primates in our particular lineage are doing something really special with their voices when they talk to their young. So what is baby talk? Well, some of the acoustic properties that we can measure are that the pitch tends to be higher for child-directed speech. So here we have infant-directed speech with an I, IDS. The pitch tends to be higher when people talk to babies, their own babies, when people talk to their own pets, and a little bit lower when they talk to adults. If you measure how excited people sound in their speech when they are talking to their own infants, their own pets, or another adult, then the infant-directed speech is the most exciting. The pet-directed speech is middle exciting, and the adult-directed speech is the least excited sounding. And if we do an F1 first formant versus F2 second formant plot, remember F1 is telling us how high up is the tongue in the mouth in this direction, and F2 is telling us how close to the front or to the back of the mouth is the tongue bunching. So we have words here, sheep, so that's the E sound, shark, that's the R sound, and shoe, that's the U sound. So between sheep, shark, shoe, we can see the adult directed speech. It's a very pale yellow color here, but quite a small triangle. The pet directed speech, also a very small triangle. It's a little bit shifted over, but it's definitely not larger. But then we look at the infant directed speech, and that triangle is huge. So people in this study were really exaggerating the way that they talk when they talk to their babies. And it seems like this may be linked to something to do with babies' hearing. You might wonder whether this is just something that crazy white people do, but it does seem to be quite widespread. It's not something that just English speakers do. There are data from Russian parents, Swedish parents. These days, there are some data from Japanese speaking parents. The data may be a little bit more mixed for Mandarin speaking parents, but I think there may be still a little more work to be done there. But in general, it seems that human adults exaggerate the way they use their mouths when they're speaking to their babies in a way that aligns with their baby's hearing. The next question we might want to ask, does it actually help? Is it useful for babies to hear more adult-directed speech? So this is a study from the US that looks at the rate of expansion for parents in their adult-directed speech and their infant-directed speech at 6 to 8 months and 10 to 12 months, and data from the same babies that is looking at their ability to pick out a picture with their eyes at high speed. And the babies whose parents have the biggest change between adult-directed speech and infant-directed speech, so the biggest vowel inflation, also show the greatest sensitivity to the speech sounds hidden in words that they're listening to while they're trying to find pictures. So this suggests that babies whose parents hyperarticulate more might be better at linking up words with their meanings in language. So, human hearing seems to get better for some sounds and worse for other sounds. And we've seen examples of both of those now. So we've seen consonants that got better and consonants that got better for some babies and worse for other babies. And we've seen vowel sensitivity that starts off asymmetrical and then ends up language specific. But we've also seen this example that adults from our community vary our own speech to help children with the learning process. So the question our curious ape must be asking at this stage is what is the learning mechanism? And is it possible that I have this way of learning as well? So the data I want to share with you on this point has to do with the statistics of language exposure. So in this beautiful study that you may have come across before in your developmental or your cognitive psychology, babies were exposed to a continuum of speech sounds drawn from along a spectrum from da to ta. And they could be presented with one of two different distributions. So the green line or the turquoise line here represents the bimodal distribution. So they heard the sound at this end of the spectrum 4 times. They heard the sound at point 2 on the spectrum 16 times, point 8, the sound at the third point on the spectrum 8 times, the sounds in the middle just 4 times each, the sound over here at 6 on the spectrum 8 times, 16 times, and 8 times again. So what you might be recognizing here is when we talked about those categories of peach and beach, the pert and the bert having a prototype, that is really strongly encoded, and then some kind of fuzzy boundary of bad examples that are less good and maybe sort of blurry at the edges, you'll probably be recognizing that that kind of prototype shape here, where tokens number 2 and number 7 are very, very well represented in the artificial language that is presented to these babies. By contrast, a second group of babies could be exposed to a string of syllables that has mostly sound 4 and sound 5, right? And these kids might be forming up a prototype that 4s and 5s are really, really normal. They're prototypes of just one category. And each of these other tokens is encountered less often and may represent a kind of an atypical stimulus. So what we can do after babies have been exposed to these kind of strings of artificial speech sounds is test them for their ability to tell the difference between this sound and this sound, right? Sound 3 and sound 6. So remember, if they were exposed to the blue stimuli, sound 3 and sound 6 come from the same category. But if they were exposed to the green or the turquoise stimuli, sound 3 and sound 6 come from different categories. And what has been shown is that depending on the category of exposure, children will indeed show different patterns. So the kids in the unimodal training condition do not detect the difference between sound 3 and sound 6, whereas kids in the bimodal training condition do detect the difference between sound 3 and sound 6. And this is true both at 6 months and at 8 months of age. And the important thing is that you can see these effects with exposure of only 2 to 3 minutes. So if kids are hearing one of these artificially constructed stimulus strings that goes da 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 da, in just 2 to 3 minutes, those connections between the representations of the speech sounds start shifting to align with the statistical structure of the speech stimulus that we are hearing. Now, this means that we have a very powerful statistical learning mechanism that is very fast to adapt over short time scales, and over the course of our entire lives is accumulating evidence about which sound features might be important for us to encode. Now, you may have come across the Hart and Risley study from 1995, which is a super exciting study that actually stuck microphones in a bunch of family homes and measured the amount of talk that was going on in those homes and looked at children's educational attainment over the course of a couple of years as they entered school. And what they found was that there were huge variations in the amount of time that adults spend in their households talking to their children. And it could vary between something like only 15 minutes of talk per hour and 40 minutes of talk per hour. And if you counted up the actual individual words, it could differ between something like 3,000 words an hour to down to just about 500 words per hour. And they extrapolated these data out to suggest that by the age of 3, some children could be hearing 11 million words, while others are hearing only 3 million. So they proposed that there might be some kind of critical minimum threshold for the amount of statistical exposure children need to their languages for them to become effectively functional in them. And they suggested 30,000 words should be some kind of a daily target. They reported that this was more likely to be hit by professional parents in their study than by blue collar or welfare parents, although I should say that there are a number of more recent studies that don't seem to show the same socioeconomic status effects as consistently as in this particular study from this community in the USA. However, in general, many studies keep replicating this idea that there are some families whose children get exposed to larger quantities of more complicated speech and some families where the children are exposed to less, and that those patterns may predict differences in the way that the perceptual system is able to cope with language. So here's one study from Anne Frenald's lab at Stanford. And this was looking at families in a disadvantaged area where even the most talkative families were still like quite below that 30,000 words per day target that Hart and Risley had proposed. And what you can see here is when the children were recorded, what was the proportion of their speech that was child-directed. Now remember, child-directed speech has those few key features of being more higher pitch, more exciting to listen to, and having those exaggerated vowels. We might want to ask ourselves the question, does it make a difference to anything? I mean, some parents might just do this more often, but it might not make any difference whatsoever. So in this study, they brought kids into the lab and checked how quickly they could find a picture at high speed with their eyes. So in this case, these were Spanish-speaking families, and they were asked to identify a dog. So we can see up here the words mira el perro. Oh, I can't say that properly. Perro. No, I still can't say that properly. Look at the dog. And what we can see at the top, this little code here, there are two lines for how quickly the eyes move from around 50% looking at the dog to looking at the other picture that is not a dog, right? The target word starts, the target word starts around here. And these two tracks both increase as a larger and larger proportion of kids end up putting their eyes on the dog picture. But what we can see is this dark bar rises up much more quickly as compared to the paler gray dots, which is down here. And so this is a median split of the children according to the kids who heard more child-directed speech at 19 months of age and less child-directed speech at 19 months of age. So the authors interpret this as a sign that the kids who are hearing more speech at home directed to them are processing the sounds of spoken language faster. So this is in line with the idea that statistical exposure helps you tune your categories so that you get those reaction time advantages that we saw over here, where the adults are much, much faster at responding to which particular word a particular speech token is compared to children, because their categories are tightly tuned. They're still a bit squiffy at the boundaries, but for the prototypes, they're very, very fast. So it looks like that prototype advantage starts very early, but is dependent on statistical input. The same study has also looked at vocabulary size for kids in these same households and the relationship between vocabulary size and processing efficiency and the child-directed speech, and all three are intercorrelated. So it seems that faster processing speed is a predictor of larger vocabulary size, but the word rate at the input end of the spectrum may be very tightly related to both of those outcomes. The other key feature that we want to think about is how this learning progresses and who is involved in the learning process. So this wonderful study from Patricia Kuhl's lab in the States involved a Chinese auntie visiting the homes of American babies for a storybook session. So there is a speech sound over here that I'm not even going to try and pronounce because I'm not quite sure how these speech sounds go, and I'm very bad at pronouncing these ones, but it's a contrast that is in Chinese, that is not in English, and probably one of the ones that I say incorrectly when I try and say your name, so I apologize. This poor ape's ears are poorly tuned to the sounds of Mandarin. So what we have here is a baby interacting with the Chinese auntie, visiting with a storybook. And American English hearing babies were compared at first on their ability to detect this contrast between what I think is hu and ku, but I'm not sure. And in the control group of Chinese babies who just hear Chinese at home, Chinese babies have a pretty good ability to detect these speech sounds. English babies have pretty bad ability to detect these speech sounds. When the Chinese auntie comes to visit, however, this is the same English speaking control group that we saw over here. And this is the Chinese visitor group. And we can see that just by having someone come and visit your home, I think it was once a week for 6 weeks for an hour or something along those lines, we get this boost in the ability to hear a contrast that normally those same kids cannot. What's critical about this study, though, is they tried seeing whether the statistical exposure to the speech sounds was sufficient in the absence of the Chinese auntie. So they had 2 additional conditions. One, they tried to train the kids with the same Chinese auntie on a video. So they played the baby the same audio track. And a second condition, they played the same auntie reading the same storybook on radio. So I'd like you to think for a moment, what do you predict the outcomes are going to show? Is the Chinese auntie going to be just as good face-to-face interactive style where everything the baby does gets a response? Or is it just the statistics of the exposure that matter? And is the Chinese auntie's voice going to be enough without her face and her engagement? Or is just the audio exposure to the ideas enough? Well, both of these conditions failed terribly by comparison. So this study has been taken as a very powerful sign that learning works best when it's socially mediated in real time with feedback between the speaker and the listener as part of their learning journey. So, time for a recap. Our curious ape has learned that it looks like human speech perception has a few key features when it comes to where it comes from and how it develops. First of all, perception is asymmetrical in that some sounds are easier to hear than others. And it's categorical because even though it might start out asymmetrical in some way that is aligned to the structure of our inner ear or the configuration of our vocal tracts, we group together some sounds as though they are similar to each other in a way where the differences among them does not matter. And other sounds we treat as so different that even a very fine-grained acoustic difference is very meaningful to us. So perception is both asymmetrical and categorical. And we've seen now that the acquisition pattern for how our perception changes over time is statistical. So it's guided by the acoustic features of the landscape and the frequency with which we hear different speech sounds. And it's social in that just hearing those sounds doesn't seem to be enough unless they are meaningfully attached to a human or human interaction. And on that note, we will pause for a break and I will see you back here shortly to find out more about these fascinating patterns in perception.